Damn it. So it feels really good to have the engine back in the car. I feel much better about it. So I got a couple rags over the cams there because I'm waiting for the valve cover to come back from powder coat. I'm gonna powder coat a special purple color. So just waiting on that, but I figured since I have a little bit of time waiting on that thing, I might as well go ahead and start working on the intercooler setup. So this is gonna take the compressed air that comes out of the turbo, it's gonna send it through this, it's gonna cool the air and then stuff it back into the motor. The cooler the charged air can be going into the motor, the more power it's gonna make and the better it's gonna be for the motor. So intercooler is very important, but there's no factory mounts for it, so I gotta mount it. That's what I'm about to figure out. So doing a little test fit on the intercooler on this thing, so I gotta figure out how to mount it so that it's not gonna fall off every time we hit a bump or if we give somebody a bump while running tandem. So what I did on my E46 is, luckily on the BMW chassis, there's these little holes right here that you can pick up. So what I do is just take a little tube, through bolt it through there, and then I'm gonna bolt it to this M8 nutsert on the top of the radiator, or the intercooler. And then we're gonna do the same thing on both sides. Should be fairly easy, I hope. Okay, so I got it all set up, just barely starting to smash it. I'm just gonna crank this thing. Nice and tight. Boom, look at that. Drill hole right there. All right, nice and sturdy, nice and straight, nice and centered. I'm really stoked on that. And I really don't have that much time into these either. It just really didn't take that long at all. So those are the top mounts. That's done. Now I just got to figure out how to keep it from swinging back and forth like this. So I think I'm going to probably add a couple more tubes on the bottom just to make sure it will never ever fall off. But I feel really good about that so far. So I got the car lifted up and I'm working on the lower mount for this intercooler. And this is about what I came up with. Something very similar to what I put on my competition car. A 3/4 inch piece of tube with a couple of tabs welded off the side of it. I was able to make that on the bench. And then I was making these two little tubes. These guys, I was lucky enough to have a little spot up here where I can through bolt. And then this is gonna give me a little pad to land this tube. And then right down there like that, I'm just gonna weld these corners so I don't have to bend anything. It'll be a little easier. I'm just gonna have to weld that thing on and that's gonna be the lower mount. I think that's gonna be plenty strong to hold up this intercooler and charge pipes. I'm working on the other side bar that's identical to this one, just mirrored. All right, really stoked on how this turned out. Got it all done. Nice. A little bit of mild seal action. I TIG welded it just so it'd be all nice and clean. Turned out really good. Now all I gotta do is pull this bracket off, pull these little guys off. I'm gonna throw some paint on them and then we will be done with mounting the intercooler. Now we can move on to making some charge pipes. So in my case, I pretty much did this entire thing on my E46 comp car, so this is all familiar territory for me. So this is the identical intercooler that I have currently on my E46 competition car. And this one seemed to work fine, and I noticed that the frame rails were the exact same width on this car as they were with the other one. So I went ahead and just hit up Mishimoto and just bought another one. They're pretty cheap, seems to work pretty good, and I've been happy with it, and just like I thought, it fits pretty much perfect in here. It's a little tight, but it works. So I'm gonna need to weld a 90-degree elbow onto the end of this Garrett turbo. So I found this little 2-inch guy and I'm gonna weld that on there and it's pretty easy. It's just gonna flow right up underneath the exhaust manifold and then drop down into the intercooler. So what I'm gonna do is I flip this over, then hang that off the edge and then I can line that right there like that, lined up well, and then I can weld it. So I've moved on to the charge pipe on the 36 and this can be a little bit difficult because when you're doing it by yourself, you only have 2 hands. So it can be tough to kind of hold everything together, mark it, all that stuff is a little bit difficult. So what I like to do is put the tube where you need it to be inside of the car, get it locked down on the turbo. So I'm picturing coming off of the turbo and then that's gonna be the hot side into the intercooler off of the turbo. So this is gonna be the little jog that comes off of the turbo and then it's gonna go to the intercooler. So this is a little bit tough. My experience with aluminum, it's difficult to tack it. That's the hardest part, is just getting a tack on it, especially when I let go of the tube, it's gonna fall off. So what I'll do is I'll put a mark right across the 2 tubes so I know exactly the clock of it, how I want it to line up, so I can get it exactly right. So now that I got that pretty much locked down, what I'm gonna do is take some blue tape, and this stuff's cool because it doesn't leave residue, because any sort of residue on this tube, it's going to make it weld really bad. So I'm gonna stick this down on here in a couple different spots, and that's just gonna help me hold it so that I can hold the filler with one hand and the torch with the other, and I don't have to have my one hand to hold the tube together. So what I'm gonna do, now that I got it pretty close to where I want it, make sure my line's pretty well lined up, we're good to go. So now I'm gonna go ahead and throw a tack on this thing. So another thing to think about when you're doing this, when you have this blue tape on here, it's gonna melt. Once you get this too hot, it'll start to melt, and once it does melt, it will leave some residue on there. So I'm gonna do my best to keep as much heat out of this as possible. So just a tiny little tack, just so it will hold still. I can peel the tape off, and then I'm gonna finish welding it out. Now I can take this thing out of there and set it in more of a comfortable position so that it's a little bit easier to weld. My preference is to have the tube laying down as opposed to trying to do it vertical like this. So I'm gonna lay this down, clamp it in the vise, and this is where I find to be the most comfortable so I can get my weld beads to look the best. I really try to get in the habit of tracing my weld first before we actually just dive right into it. So what I'll do is I'll try to get comfortable, pretend like I'm starting here, okay, we're dipping, we're good. Oh, it feels a little bit uncomfortable right there. I can change the torch angle just a little bit, and that way you really just set yourself up for success, because if you're kind of welding out of comfort, it's gonna end up looking really bad on your weld. So it's always good to trace it a couple times, make sure you're good and comfortable, so that all your buddies looking at your car will be impressed with your welds. One down, about 6 to 10 to go. So if you're really, really worried about this thing looking extra good, you can see that this tube has a little bit of, you can see some scratches in it. It doesn't look perfect. I grabbed some Scotch-Brite, and what I'll do when I'm completely done welding on the charge pipe and it's done sliding around on the welding table getting scratched, you'll just go ahead and get this wet, this piece of Scotch-Brite here, and you basically just scratch this whole thing, and it will give it a super, super nice, super sweet finish on the whole thing. It will be nice and even. It kind of flattens the welds out. It kind of gets rid of the high spots and low spots and really just makes it shine all as one piece. So that's what I usually do. I really like the way it looks. I've been doing it for a while. So if you're into it, give it a try.